Hi, so in this tutorial, we're going to learn all about the new timeline feature in Unity 2017.1. Timeline is a sequencing tool, and we're going to be using it to create a short 30-second animation that's using Timeline, the new Cinemachine tool, and a bunch of different things that you've probably already used in Unity before for animating. We're going to create a short 30-second animation of a character that's doing some kung fu in a weird neon forest, and basically learn about how Timeline, Cinemachine, virtual cameras, the Dolly Track, and all of these things kind of work together to make our short film. So without further ado, let's take a look at what we're going to be making. And you can see that it's an animation that starts off with a drone shot overhead. It has music that fades in, it has a fade in from black. And these cameras are focusing on this main character, and they're kind of shifting perspective. They've also got depth of field applied to them. And you can see that when we move between these different cameras, we're getting a kind of different shot of the character each time. And then slowly it kind of fades out towards the end. So it's just a short animation. And we're going to look at how all of this is put together with Timeline and Cinemachine. So the project that you need for this tutorial is linked in the download below. So go and grab that. It's got Cinemachine pre-installed. It's got the post-processing stack pre-installed. And basically it's got the same copy of the scene that you just saw ready to go, but without all of the Timeline and Cinemachine stuff that we're going to build. So if you open up Timeline Forest start scene that's in the project, then hopefully it looks something like this to begin with. So currently we have our character, and that character is just driven by an animator controller that has a single animation, which is just some motion capture of Kung Fu. Now that motion capture is from the Carnegie Mellon University mocap session. And if you search for that online, you can find a full library of a whole bunch more cool stuff. But basically, I've just taken this rigged character and applied this Kung Fu asset to it. So basically, he is looking like this right now if I play the scene. You can see that he's just pulling off these moves. He's currently not really focused in the depth of field. It's currently focused on somewhere near the tree. And all of these things kind of need fixing and putting together. But as you can tell, we've only got one camera to begin with. So we need to actually start putting all of this together and using Timeline, using Cinemachine to build up this animation. So the first thing I'm going to do is put in an empty game object to house all of our virtual cameras. So I'm going to just click create and create an empty game object. I'm going to call this CM for Cinemachine Cameras. And I'm going to reset the position of that on the transform component by clicking on the gear icon and choosing reset position. Now underneath this, I'm going to nest all of my cameras just for neatness, and also because it helps whenever you're animating anything in Unity to make sure that you're kind of parenting things under something that's not going to be animated in and of itself. So that's that empty game object. So the first thing I'm going to do, and what I want you to notice, is that at the top there is a top menu called Cinemachine. And that's because I've already imported the Cinemachine package from the asset store. So in the asset store, I've searched for Cinemachine, or you could also go to the Unity Essentials area and you'll find Cinemachine in there. There it is. And you'll also find the post-processing stack. Now, those two are already in this project, so you don't need to do any of that. So the first thing I'm going to do is to click on my Cinemachine, and I'm going to say create virtual camera. Now, what does that do? Well, it creates something called CM VCam1, which is a Cinemachine virtual camera. It's the first one in the scene. And it also applies a component called the Cinemachine brain to our main camera. So the Cinemachine brain just says that any virtual cameras in the scene can take over from the main camera and effectively act as a render target. So that renderer, the main camera, is just outputting to the game view now. And any virtual camera that we use is going to overtake it by proxy of this brain component. So the brain is now viewing what's ever in that virtual camera, and you can see that one is just kind of stuck in a weird position. So what I could do is kind of move it around, but what you'll notice is when I try and drag it, it's not moving. Now that's because this virtual camera is bound to do a particular thing. So we can do a bunch of different things with a virtual camera. We can position it specifically and have it just sit there in the scene, or we can tell it to look out and follow a particular, subject. So the character is our main subject in this, and him standing there doing all that kind of kung fu, he kind of paces back and forth a little bit as he does it. And what we want to do with that is to kind of gently follow and track the motion of that with the camera back and forth. So what we're going to do is open up our character, and what you'll see in there is that we have this thing called follow target. Now, follow target is something that we can drag and drop onto the look at and also the follow. So if I just reposition my game view real quick down at the bottom here, you'll see that my virtual camera is now positioned behind the character. So if I pull out in the game view, you'll see there's this red line, and that red line represents the actual distance to the character and what it's following. Now, what is follow target? Now, follow target is just an empty transform that I've placed underneath the hierarchy of the character. It's not anything specific to Timeline or Cinemachine. When you want to follow something with a virtual camera, you can see that it's just looking for a transform. So you can tie this to pretty much any game object because every game object has a transform. So what I'm going to do now is control the body and use my follow offset to define exactly how that camera is following and looking at the character, or the follow target to be specific. So you can see if I drag my X, Y, and Z values, I can control exactly how that shot's composed. So I might arrange it something like that. So also to note, this is in the body of a virtual camera. So the body is controlling what the virtual camera is doing. The aim does a bit more detail about how the shot's composed, but we can get the kind of basics of our follow by playing around with that. So I'm going to just tweak it until it's something like that. So my values minus 1.2-ish, minus 0.3, and minus 6 in the Z. So when I press play now, my virtual camera is going to be taking over the shot, and it's actually following this guy backwards and forwards as he kind of paces around. So obviously my follow target is moving as the character's neck moves around, because that's exactly where it's placed on the character. And as he animates, you can see that the camera is just moving slightly back and forward if you watch the background as we play. Now, what we also want to do is say that we want to follow focus. So with our main camera, we have our post-processing stack applied to it. This post-processing behavior is what ties the profile to the camera. Now, because the Cinemachine brain knows about that, it's automatically applied to any virtual camera as well. So what we want to do is make sure that we are tracking the target. Now, luckily, Cinemachine has a component for just this purpose. So if you reselect the main camera and go to Add Component and search for Post, and you'll see Cinemachine Post Effects as a component. Now, what that does is it basically looks for an existing profile on the main camera and does what it can to override it. So we have within our tutorial folder a post-processing folder in which I have a existing post profile. Now I'm going to make sure that that's applied to my Cinemachine post effects. And you can see that when I drop it onto that component, it then reassigns this component, the original behavior script, to have whatever's in there. Now the reason for that is that you can override this per virtual camera. I've done this on the main camera, but if I want to have different post profiles on different virtual cameras, I can do that, and you'll see that later on. But for now, what we want to do is to say that the focus tracks the target. Now, all that means is any virtual camera that uses the look at and follow, the follow to be specific, it's going to use that as the focal range. So in a post profile, you'll see that there's a depth of field and it has focus distance. Now, what the focus tracks target does is to say whatever distance that transform is away from the camera, that's going to basically track at all times. So when the camera moves and when that distance changes, it's constantly changing that depth of field to make sure that the target, i.e. the character in this instance, stays in focus. So let's take a look at that now that we've tracked the target. So now what we should see is that the character is nicely in focus, and as he moves backwards and forwards, he doesn't go out of focus, which is fantastic. Now, this is good, but we want to do something with more than one camera, right? So we need to add more than one virtual camera, and then we've got to start thinking about how we'll switch between them. So the first thing I'm going to do is add in my second virtual camera. I'm just going to duplicate CMVCam1, and I'm going to just rename it. So F2 on PC, return on Mac, and I'm going to just put a 2 on the end for simplicity. Now, as I'm working with these, actually what I really want to do is start thinking about what the shots are. So that first shot, I would maybe call that a mid shot. So I'm going to call this CM mid shot. And this next one, I'm going to go into the body. So I'm reselecting my second VCam, and I'm going to increase the Z value until I'm at, say, -2, and I'm going to also increase the X value a little bit so that we're at something like that. Maybe pull up in the Y axis, something like this. So I'm basically coming in for a kind of a close-up shot. So my values have ended up with -0.5, probably 0 in Y, and -2 in Z for my follow offset. So then what I'm going to do is rename this second virtual camera to CM close-up. So these names are actually useful. These names will come in handy in a moment when we look at it in Timeline, because Timeline is going to show you those on the actual clips in the Timeline itself. So let's take a look at how we can now move between those with Timeline. So we've got these set up, and like I said, CM cameras is going to be holding all of these. So the first thing I'm going to do before I start animating, before I start transitioning between these cameras, is to parent them underneath CM cameras. So grab your mid shot and your close up, drop it onto CM cameras. Now, what you won't see if you play now is any difference between those two cameras, because they both have the same priority. So if you look at both of these, there is a priority value here and it says 10. If I choose my close up, I can solo it, or I can reselect my mid shot, I can solo that, and you'll see the difference between the two shots. But otherwise, we have nothing right now which is allowing us to, effectively change between those. So what I'm going to do before I carry on is I'm going to just save my scene. So I'm going to say File, Save. And then what I'm going to do is bring in my timeline window. So you might not have this already. So if you look in Window and go to Timeline Editor, then I've already pulled this out and I've docked it. So you might want to dock it down at the bottom. It's somewhere I find to be a useful place to dock it. So I'm going to just move my interface a little bit around. And I tend to dock that there, and I tend to put my game view alongside the scene so that when I'm animating, I get to see the game view switch up here or maximize if I want it to. I'm going to uncheck that for now. So the timeline. Well, the timeline basically needs us to have a timeline asset created to store all these different animations. So what I'm going to do is to select my CM cameras, and I'm going to add a component that's going to basically control all of our animation by proxy of the timeline asset. So what does that mean? Well, basically I need to add a component to CM cameras, and that component is the playable director. So if you go to add component and type in play, you'll very quickly see playable director, and you can double click that to add it. Now what you'll see is that we have a particular playable. Now that playable is going to be our timeline asset. And then we have a thing like the update method, we have play on awake, which is pretty obviously what we want, and we have wrap mode, which is, does it repeat, does it loop, etc. Now what I'm going to do first is to make a new timeline asset. So I'm going to encourage you folks to create this in the root, because I've already got some in the tutorial folder which are for the completed scene. So for now we'll just go to create on the project panel, having deselected any folders so it doesn't create them inside the folder. I'm going to go to create, and I'm going to say timeline. And I'm going to name this, I'll call it cutscene. Why not? Now, this particular asset just needs assigning to our playable director. So I can do that quickly by dragging and dropping this new timeline asset onto CM cameras. And you can see it's then assigned as the playable to do something with. And now what you can also see is that cutscene is listed as the thing that we're working on in the timeline window. And it says there are no tracks in this timeline. So let's talk about that. So timeline has a number of different track types. So you can group tracks. You can have activation, which will switch on and off a game object. You can have animation, which basically works like any other animation in Unity. It, basically adheres to a particular game object in the scene, and it allows you to tie any property there by adding keys to it and, tweening it over time, either with curves or simple dope sheet. And then you can add audio tracks. You can add a control track, which will allow you to effectively control one timeline from another. We're not going to cover that today, but we'll talk about that another time. And then there's playables, which get into more detail, and you can actually write custom types per track, which makes Timeline way more than just a sequencing tool because it can blend any data type, which is pretty awesome. Then the other one that you'll notice, which is added below this line because Cinemachine is currently a plugin, is this Cinemachine track. Now that is basically what we want to start off with here because we're going to be using that to blend between different camera shots. So the first track I'm going to get you to add is to go to Cinemachine Timeline and add Cinemachine track. Now, the first thing you'll see here is that there is an empty field, an empty new track, and something that says none on it. And it says Cinemachine Brain. Now, what do we add to that? Well, the main camera is the thing that we want to tie to this because although we are animating between different virtual cameras, what we actually want to do is to say, okay, well, any virtual camera clips that are in this are ultimately feeding back into the main camera as the thing to render. So all we're going to do first, because it's looking for a Cinemachine Brain and we know that that's the component that exists on the main camera, is just to drag and drop our main camera onto that field. So now that's ready to receive different virtual cameras feeding it a particular shot. So what I'm going to do is right click in this space and you can see it has an option for add Cinemachine shot clip. So I click on that and I get something called Cinemachine shot. So it's just this default clip in the timeline that doesn't have a virtual camera assigned to it just yet. So what I'm going to do is to look over in the inspector once it's selected and I can see there's virtual camera there. Now all I want to do is just drag on first my mid shot as the thing to assign. And you can see this clip gets renamed, which is why it was important that we rename it, to the name of that virtual camera that's assigned. And it's a super handy thing is it takes all of the properties of the virtual camera and just puts them into the inspector for this particular clip. So I can drag this around, I can retime it, I can move it around, I can snap it onto things. And these are all fairly standard features of any kind of sequencing tool. But the best thing about it is that I can use this to blend between virtual cameras. So obviously what I want to do next is to bring in my second virtual camera. So I'm going to make another Cinemachine shot clip, right click, add Cinemachine shot clip, and here is another one. Now I'm going to assign my close up to the virtual camera slot. And you can see that I've now got a clip named CM close up. And now when I move between them, you can see that in the timeline by dragging this playhead, I'm switching cameras. So let's play our scene right now and see actually what this looks like to begin with. So I'm going to click play at the top or Command P or Control P on Windows. And you can see it switches. Now it only plays once currently and then jumps back to the currently active camera. But we're going to do something a little bit more interesting. So the first thing I'm going to do is to create a blend. So this is super easy with a Cinemachine shot clip because all I need to do is just to drag one over the other to create that blend. So now if I press play, what we'll see is that they effectively blend from one position to another instead of hard cutting. So you can see that kind of zoom as it kind of rushes over. Let's see that one more time. So those are our first two cameras. That's the start of our animation. So the next thing we're going to do is to have a look at the dolly track in Cinemachine and in Unity. So what I'm going to do is just position my view in the scene view to a little bit overhead. Then I'm going to introduce a new type of Cinemachine thing that we haven't looked at yet, which is a dolly camera with track. So what this is going to do is add a new virtual camera, and it's also going to add a dolly track, which is a separate game object, and we'll look at how to set that up. So go to Cinemachine at the top menu and create dolly camera with track. So I've created both of these, and before I do anything with them, I'm going to parent them onto CM cameras, and then I'm ready to start working. So where is this dolly track? Well, we can't see it right away because it doesn't really have any waypoints on the path. Effectively, the Cinemachine Dolly Track is a set of waypoints, and you can basically attach a camera to it and it's going to run along that. So you could do like a roller coaster and do some really interesting stuff. We're going to do a really simple on-rails traditional linear dolly today. So the first thing I'm going to do is add a waypoint to the path. So select your dolly track and click the big Add Waypoint to Path button. So add waypoint to a path is effectively putting in the first waypoint. And then what you're going to see is, potentially kind of a confusing looking set of things. There's 3 transform handles here, and you might be thinking, what exactly is going on? What are these there to do? Now, this will become a bit clearer once we add more waypoints. So let's just do that right away. If you expand path details and click on the plus button at the bottom, right here, then you'll add a second position in. And then you start to see this dolly track. So the dolly track is this green set of rails with the segments in the middle that we call ties, because they tie the track together. Now, in order to create the dolly track that we want position 0, so the first ever point in the, or waypoint in the array, and then position 1 to be in different places. So I'm not going to move that in X, so I'm going to reset my X position to 0. I'm going to set my Z position, or my Z position, to 20. So you can see here that my track now stretches out. Now the next thing I'm going to do is just raise this up into the air above the tree. So I'm going to set that to a position of, well, something like that for now. So something around the kind of 15 mark. And I know that my camera is already tied to it. Because we created them together, you'll see that the body is set to tracked dolly. Now that is something that's kind of already set up for you, and that means that it's already also assigned to this dolly track. You can see that in the path, this particular game object is assigned. And if I rename that, it'll get renamed, etc. But they're already tied together, so we don't need to worry about that, which is fantastic. So we do want to worry about exactly where this is positioned, and we want it to fly over the character. So without moving the waypoints, I am just going to start it off in roughly the right place. So I'm going to set this back, knowing that our character is in the middle here, so he's down here. I want the camera to kind of move overhead. Now, what you'll also notice is that the track itself has started to look kind of weird and curved. Now, we don't want the track to curve because we don't want the camera to kind of move a little bit as it goes along. We want a really nice linear straight path, a nice overhead kind of drone type shot. So I'm going to just fiddle with how that behaves and basically look at the tangents. So the tangents are acting as a Bezier curve. So what you'll see is that tangents are there to allow you, if you select a waypoint, so if I select 0, I can drag these tangents around, and you can see that the tangent XYZ fields are changing as I drag them. Now, we don't want that tangent to go anywhere, so I'm going to set the tangent values to 0 for both of those. Then I can start thinking about how I want that to move. So the next thing to notice is if I increase the width of the appearance here, it's a lot easier to see. So that doesn't affect how it moves. It's just a nicer way to see it. So what you'll notice next is that there are some ties that are closer together next to each of these waypoints. Now, basically, that is just the tangent not being spaced out kind of evenly in order to get a good spread. So what I'm going to do is just increase both Z fields until these ties look evenly spaced. So I can set this to Let's keep them the same number. Let's say 7 in each. And then they look kind of evenly spaced to me. And the important thing about this is that we're going to animate the path position. So what is the path position? So the path position is basically there to drive that camera along the dolly track. So when I click back on my virtual camera, what I'll see is in the body where the dolly track is assigned, there is a value called path position. And if I drag this, you can see that I can go from 0 to 1. 1 being the first waypoint after 0. So if I go to about halfway, I'm at around 0.5, I'm in the middle of the track. And we're going to animate this exact value from 0 to 1 over time in order to get that nice smooth linear motion. So by default, I want it to stay on 0 because I want it to start in a particular place. So really what we need to do is start looking at how this looks in the game view. So I'm going to just very quickly dock my game view over here. And I can see that the camera is facing forwards right now, which is not what we want. So I'm going to select my VCam 1 and just in the rotation in the transform in X, I'm going to set that to 90 degrees in order to face downwards. So once that's done, when I go back to path position and kind of move that around, you can see that if I drag this backwards and forwards, I'm panning over the top or dollying over the top of the character, which is exactly what we want. So I'm going to start off on 0 and then I'm going to use my timeline to animate this value. So what I'm going to do is select my CM cameras because that's where my timeline is, and that means my timeline window is going to light back up. And I'm going to just quickly lock that so that when I click on something else, it's not going to lose focus. And there's a tiny padlock icon to the corner of that window, much like the inspector. So what I need to do is to create a shot for this so I can actually see it as part of my animation. And then I'm going to start animating it. So I'm going to right click in my existing track and add a Cinemachine shot clip again. I'm going to rename my camera in here, call it CM drone, because that's the kind of effect I'm going for with this virtual camera. And then I'm going to select my Cinemachine shot clip and assign my CM drone camera to the virtual camera slot. So now you can see that it's going from mid shot to close up to drone. And the drone isn't doing anything because we haven't animated it yet. So you'll remember in the original clip, what we actually did was start off with that drone. So let's actually reverse how all of these fit together. So I'm going to zoom out with my mouse wheel and I'm going to select my two shots. I'm going to just drag them to the end. And I'm going to put my drone shot at the start. Now I want to work in seconds. So in the timeline, you can actually set this to seconds instead of frames. So in my first few seconds, I want my drone to be panning over the top. So I'm going to make that around about 5 seconds. So that's perfect. This kind of default thing is around about 5 seconds. So that's really good. So my drone needs to be told to move along the dolly track. So as I said, we need to animate a particular value. If we want to animate something, we need to add a new track in order to keyframe. So I'm going to click on the add button on the timeline and say animation track. Now, what am I going to animate? Well, I'm going to animate my drone because on the drone, that's where the path position property exists. So I'm going to drag on my drone as the thing to animate. And when I drop it on, you can see it's expecting an animator. So when I let go, it says, oh, you haven't actually got an animator. So do you want to create one? And I'm like, hell yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you very much. And that's exactly what it does. So now if I click back on my drone, you can see that it's got an animator component that's basically allowing Timeline to drive this thing. You don't need to create a controller or anything like that. It's basically just driving it for you. So the cool thing about that is that now I can animate anything on this game object. So how am I going to do that? Well, I've got this animation record button. So straight away, I'm going to just click on that. And now I can see that I've got recording armed on this track. So in order to record this particular value now that this is armed and this whole game object is potentially animatable, I can right click on path position and say add key. So that now means that this is being keyframed. So then I've got a key in my timeline. You can see there's one little diamond shaped key there. And now down the timeline I go, I can just drag this. I can drag this anywhere I want. So basically I can put this outside here and it doesn't matter because it's still just driving the value on that game object. So I'm going to put my playhead somewhere near the end of the clip. It really doesn't matter where. And then I'm going to set the path position to 1. Type that in, hit return, and that's made the keyframe as soon as I've done it. And now you can see that we're driving this camera overhead because it's basically saying go from waypoint 0 to waypoint 1 over time. And then once it's done that, I want it to jump cut to my mid shot, and I want my mid shot to blend into my close-up. So I drag and I snap that on, and then I drag and I overlap these two. I'm going to jump out of record mode by clicking on the record button again, so we're not still creating keys for the drone. And I'm going to take a look at my work so far. Before I do that, I'm going to go to File Save and update my scene. So you can see the drones flying over, and then I switch between those two shots. So what we do need to fix about this is that the drone isn't particularly focused on the character as it's flying over. So we kind of want to figure out potentially a different post profile. And remember earlier that I said that you can have any number of different virtual cameras, and on those virtual cameras you can override the post-processing profile by just adding a different one, and that one will then take over from the one on the main camera. So what I'm going to do is to select my CM drone, and I'm going to add a Cinemachine post effects. So I'm going to search for post. I'm going to add my Cinemachine post effects thing on there. Now for this one, I'm going to go and assign something that I've already made for you. So I've made something called post profile drone, and I'm going to drop it on there. Now this time I can basically ignore focus tracks target because I'm basically just going for a distinct distance from the character, or from the camera I should say. So with this one I can ignore focus tracks target because I'm just going for a distinct distance from the camera itself. And I know that height isn't going to change and the character is not going to move up and down. So I can just go into this post profile by selecting post profile drone, and I can play around with the focal distance to make sure that it's in focus. And I can see if I just increase my game view a little bit, that a value of around about 6 is probably fine. And just to make this super obvious, what you'll also notice is that motion blur isn't in this profile. If I flick between the two profiles, motion blur is in the main one, but not in this one. I don't want it to fully blur out when the camera is panning across. That's really important because motion blur effectively works on, movement that it sees in the scene. So we don't want everything to be blurred out on the first shot. So I'm going to remove that. To make it super obvious, I might just increase the bloom on this one so that when it cuts to the other one, you can really see the difference. But you could do pretty much anything you want. You could increase kind of chromatic aberration, make it kind of super intense to start off with, and then change to a different shot. But yeah, so basically that's only applied to the drone. All of the others, because they don't have that component, so the close-up and the mid-shot, are going to switch back to the standard post profile that's on the main camera in the Cinemachine post effects component. So let's have a look at that again. I'm going to deselect this so that we don't see the overlays, and I'm going to maximize this time just so you can see it a little bit easier. So for the first 5 seconds, we're seeing that drone shot overhead. Then we jump cut over to this one, and we have a slightly different post profile, and then it's over once it's moved between those two blends. So what you'll notice now is that the animation of this going over kind of comes to an awkward halt at this point. Now, what I do want it to do is keep moving linearly, but what we can do is just move that keyframe along in order to move more slowly. So it's going to take longer to actually reach that point. And really what I want it to do is to cut when the camera's round about here. So I can either reduce my clip, but I actually want it to last 5 seconds. So I want it to go to here in terms of the timing of the whole piece. So instead, what I'm going to do is move this keyframe. Now, what you can't do in Timeline right now is to edit this dope sheet, but what you can do is double click on it to open up the animation editor. And what I tend to do is just grab this and dock it somewhere sensible above the timeline. So I'm going to put my game view back where it was, next to the scene view. And now I've got my scene and I've got my animation view above the timeline. I don't need that much height for timeline, so I'm going to move it down a little bit. Same for my animation editor. Now, these keyframes you can see are basically the keys that we recorded into the Cinemachine drone track. Now, what I want to do with that is to move it along in time so that it takes longer for the drone to actually get to that point. So by 5 seconds, it's actually less far along. So let's look at the game view as we do this. So I want to see the shot get to somewhere like this by the time it cuts to the other camera, because I think that'll just generally be a better thing for it. And you can see that as I move this keyframe along, it's getting longer. Now, of course, another way to do this is just to change the value. I might say that at this point, I can see 0.6 in the animation. So I could just drop this back to the 5 seconds that I'm expecting, jump to that keyframe using this button here, and then type in a value of 0.6. And it'll create the same effect. It'll get to that point and then cut. What you'll also notice it doing is kind of easing in, coming to some kind of motion, and then slowing back down towards the end, which is not what we want for this. We want it to be a very consistent, smooth, linear motion. So the way that we solve that is just to make sure that these curves, because they are effectively curved keyframes, aren't curved at all. They have linear tangents to them. So what we do is we single click in here, and then I'm going to do Control A or Command A on Mac to select all my keyframes. Then in the animation editor, I'm just switching from dope sheet to curves. Then I'm going to hover my mouse over here and press F to frame. Then I get to see everything. So I can right click on these and go to both tangents and say linear. That removes those Bezier curves and means that it's a straight shot between those two values. So now when I scrub back and play, it's moving at a consistent rate as it goes along and then cuts. So if you're ever animating and you're like, I don't like this kind of easing in and out kind of look, make sure you go into your keyframes, right click on them, and you can play around with the tangents. You can make them linear so that it just goes from one to another. Super, super useful. And it obviously applies to all kinds of different animation things too. So that's my drone. It goes into my mid shot, it goes into my close up. Then I've got a couple more shots that I want to add in here, and I'm just going to reuse my existing cameras. So I'm going to go back to my mid shot, and I'm going to add in yet another one. So I'm going to duplicate that game object. I'm going to call this CM long shot. And I'm going to make sure that my long shot is somewhere else. So my long shot, if I solo this, is currently the same as the mid shot because it's in the same position. But I'm not going to create my long shot by moving it, because remember, it's tied very distinctly to the follow target. So the follow offset is the thing I'm going to use to actually control this. So I'm going to drag my X value to kind of pivot around it. And you can see that it kind of keeps going. And then I can move my Z value as well until I'm somewhere underneath the ship. So I get this kind of nice kind of sense of scale from having the ship overhead. So I've set my X value to, let's say, 15, my Z value to 30, and I might just bring that down to the ground for kind of a nice low shot. So minus 1.3 is what I've ended up in the Y-axis there. So I need another shot for this. So I'm going to create yet another Cinemachine shot clip. So I right click in my track, add Cinemachine shot clip. And then I'm dragging on my long shot. And you can see that when I drag over it, it cuts to my long shot. So again, I might want to do a kind of quick blend over to that. So I could just drag slightly. Obviously, the less overlap, the quicker the blend is going to be. And then because it's a long shot, it is going to follow, but I want to kind of make it a bit more interesting. So without kind of speaking too abstractly, let's just click off of that in the hierarchy. I'm going to save my scene. So remember, file save. And then I'm going to play just to see how it's looking so far. So I've got my nice kind of steady drone with my crazy bloom. And I cut to my character, mid shot, then close up. Then I jump over to my long shot over here. So what am I going to do with that? Well, with the long shot, I kind of want it to be kind of tracking in. So again, I'm going to use animation to change the follow offset so that it's effectively kind of pulling closer to the character. So what I'm going to do is to create another animation track. So in the timeline, I'm going to click on add and go to animation track. And this time I'm going to drag on my long shot. And I'm going to say yes, create animator on the long shot. And I'm going to reselect my long shot and arm the track. So click on the red arming button. And I'm going to get myself to where I want it to be because I don't want to start keyframing right at the start. Just going to use my mouse wheel to zoom out a little bit. And when I get to the start of this, a good tip is to generally, if you're creating any kind of motion, is to start your keyframing before you actually need the clip to be visible. Because you don't want to cut to a clip and then see that shot start moving. You want it to be already moving as if it was, an actual dolly shot that had been edited, in a film. So I'm going to pull back a little bit. I'm going to add in a keyframe by right-clicking on follow offset and choosing add key. So that's now keyframing this vector 3 that's controlling that. So I'm going to solo this camera so I can see it in the game view. And over time, so over a few seconds, I'm going to change my Z value by tuning it down a bit to kind of pull closer to the character. I'm going to kind of keep it straight by reducing the X as well. So you can see I've set the X to around 7, the Z to around 24. And you can see if I drag back on the timeline, I'm kind of doing this kind of weird pull in. But it's going to be interesting. It's going to just add a bit of motion to that long shot, make it a little bit more interesting. Then I'm going to just drag this back a little bit because I don't want that long a general piece. I want it to be fairly short. Let's make it a bit longer, something like that. So I'm going to stop my recording. I'm going to double click on this to open in the animation editor and just move those keyframes around a little bit. I'm going to drag my end keyframe on. You can see it updates in the timeline window. Okay, so something like that should be fine. And then I'm going to be blending back to my mid shot. So with my mid shot, I'm going to blend back to it, but I don't need to make another clip. I can just duplicate this. So I can go select the mid shot. I'm going to hit Command C. I'm going to move my playhead over here and Command V, and it just snaps it onto the end there. Then I'm going to do a blend from one to the other. Okay, so now that we've done that, I'm going to save and click off in the hierarchy and play my scene one more time. So we have our overhead shot around about 5 seconds. We jump cut to our mid shot, blend to our close up, then blend over to our long shot that's kind of pulling in. Then we blend back to our mid shot again. And that's what we've got so far. So this is all pretty easy, and obviously we can tweak all of this. I'm actually wanting to tweak this, and I'm going to do it now. So quick tip, Alt drag in the timeline to move along it and drag on this kind of ruler at the top. And what I'm feeling is that the general kind of timing of this isn't great right now. The mid shot and close up are kind of over too quickly. So I'm going to move these down the timeline, and I'm going to move my close up along a little bit, have a bit more mid shot, and have a lot more close up. And I might actually jump cut to the long shot as well, just to make it a little bit more interesting. So I'm going to check on how I'm doing for time, and I'm going to increase my long shot a little bit, and then go back to my mid shot, something like this. So obviously it doesn't matter how you do yours, just so that you're aware of how this workflow works is the kind of point of this tutorial. So what you'll notice now, of course, is that I've moved my long shots keyframes. So I'm just going to double click on this and just move them back to the right place. So I can Command A and I can drag in the bar at the top to move them together in time. So you can see as I move them along, after a couple of seconds, they update in the timeline view. And I'm going to keep moving them along and making that appropriate, making it work for this. So I'm basically lining up these two keyframes with the start and end of the clip, because I want it to kind of keep moving over time. I'm even going to drag that past the end of the blend in order to make sure it's still moving. Yeah, so that should be pretty good. But for now, what we've got is a bunch of different camera shots. And we're going back to our mid shot at the end. And what I'm going to do is just end on a slightly different mid shot. So I'm going to move my mid shot along, and I'm going to go back to my close up. Put that close up in here. So effectively kind of just going back through. So we've gone from drone to mid to close to long, back to close, back to mid. And that will effectively be our kind of ending. But with this one, what we're going to do with the mid shot is again animate some change. So we're going to animate this kind of pulling away and changing over time. So I'm going to create another animation track. I'm going to drag on my mid shot, drop it in there, create an animator. I can hit record and select my mid shot game object and then pretty much animate anything. So again, I'm going to use the body sections follow offset. So I'm going to right click on any of these values and choose add key. So when I add key, I'm going to go to my mid shot up here just before it starts and then start keyframing. So I might want to change the Z value. So I'm going to solo this so I can see it. And what you'll see is that I've ended up inside a tree, which is what I don't want. So I'm going to move my X first of all, very importantly, and then start pulling back with that. So I've set up the first keyframe. I move down the track by dragging the playhead along. And then once I start nudging this, then it makes the next keyframe. I might even pull up a little bit as we go out. So you can see now that we have the same kind of follow. So it's going to be moving backwards and forwards, swaying with the character as the character moves, because it is following him. We're just easing off the distance at which it follows him in different axes. So you get this nice kind of pull out as we end the animation. I'm going to switch off the arming of my recording, very important. I'm going to go to File Save, that's really important too. And then we are done with our cameras. So very easily we've gone through, we've created a bunch of different shots. I'm going to unsolo that will help. And we've created a short animation. So we want to polish this, we want to finish it off. So let's take a look at how it is so far. We start off on our drone with its bloom and chromatic aberration. Then we go to our mid shot. Now, what you saw there was that the mid shot started inside a tree. So we don't want that, obviously. And that's because we've added some differences to how that works. So the follow offset in the mid shot here, we don't want that to be by default any different. So this -10 value is no good for the starting value. But you can see as I try and change it, then it starts to freak out and get confused because we've got keyframes in here. Double click on the CM mid shot track to bring that up. So now what you'll see is that I've got a keyframe at the start, which is controlling that same value, follow offset. So here, if I expand that, you can see the different values in here. Now they're controlled by these keyframes, and I don't actually want that as my mid shot value to begin with. So what I do want is to figure out what it's supposed to be. So in my timeline, I know that a value that's something like -7, something like that, that's probably the value that I actually want there. So I'm going to go into my keyframe, go back to the start, and just make sure that it's not messing anything up, overriding it. I'm going to jump to the next keyframe, make sure that's on -7 when it starts off too. So it's going on a linear value between those points and not getting overridden. So if you ever get into any kind of confusion where you're like, oh yeah, but it's just assuming values and I can't change them in here, that's because you've got a keyframe overriding. And when you see something in blue in the inspector, that's because there are keyframes for that thing. In red means you're actually recording them right now, but blue means they're already there. Now that I've corrected that problem, I should be ready to watch. So let's check it one more time. So start off with my drone, jump cut to my mid shot, jump to my close up, jump to my long shot, which is a little bit too close to the ground because it's clearly clipping through the ground. Back to the close up, then to the mid shot, and then slowly pull out with the mid shot. So that's going good. That's looking cool, except for my long shot, which is too low down, as we saw. And remember, I've animated that as well. So when I click on my CM cameras to get my timeline back up, I can see that I've got a long shot value in there. And one thing that you can do to just check the values you've got rather than double clicking it, you can double click it to see the follow offset, or you can click on this tiny button here to show the curves that you've got. And you can edit them in line if you want to. So the follow offset is set up in here. So when I get to this point, what I'm going to do is just double click it and play around with it in the animation editor. So I'm going to snap onto my keyframe using this go to next keyframe button. And then I'm going to just make sure that it's slightly higher up in the y-axis. So I'm going to hit record on here so that I can just go ahead and tweak the values. So I can reselect my long shot. I'm going to solo it so I can see it. And I'm going to bring it up in the y-axis so it's not going to clip through the ground. Something like that, 0.68. And I'm going to jump over to my next keyframe as well. Just make sure that's also a decent value off the ground. So it's maintained that Y value, which is good. So it's only X and Z that are changing, which is perfect. So I'm going to deselect, record, and now hopefully when I play back, it'll all be good. I'm going to unsolo the camera and Control P for play. So what you'll notice there when we start out as well is that the dolly track, it tends to kind of bounce back when it plays. Now, what you need to check with something like a dolly track is that on the camera itself, you don't have any kind of damping. And by default, there is a Z damping value. Basically, that means that it's kind of going to slowly catch up with where it's meant to be. So if you set that Z damping down to 0 for the drone, then it's not going to do that. It's going to adhere to exactly where you told it to be. So we're going to do that. We're going to save and we're going to press play one more time. And when it plays, it's not bouncing anywhere. It's going to where it needs to be. The other last thing that you should always do with this is to make sure that by default, without animation, the path position is set to 0, because that means it's not starting anywhere different either. The animation tells it to start at 0 and the scene by default has it at 0. So that and the Z damping can sometimes trip you up when using a dolly track. So when I press play now, you can see it starts at the exactly right place. And now it jump cuts and into my close up. Character turns around and we jump cut to the long. No longer dug in the ground, which is great. And then we jump cut back to our close up. And then we pull out to our mid. And we're slowly pulling away. So another fun thing that you can do with things like this is to play around with other camera settings. Remember, we're making something feel a bit more like a cinematic. So something I might do as I pull out there is to play around with the field of view in my mid shot. So in my mid shot, I'm going to reselect CM cameras to bring up my timeline. And I've already got an animation track for CM midshot. So all I'm going to do there is just move over here, hit record. And actually I'm doing it for my last midshot. So what I'm going to do now is play around with the field of view because I think that will be a kind of interesting, fun effect. So I'm going to select my midshot camera. I'm going to solo it so that we can see it. Definitely got that one on the screen. And then I'm going to right click on field of view and go to add key. Then as we pull out, so I'm going to move towards the end of the timeline, I'm going to add another keyframe and change the value. So as we pull out, I'm going to expand the field of view to, let's say 60, so that we're pulling out and we're also kind of widening the lens, which will give this kind of interesting effect as we play it. So we've got a keyframe where it's 40 and we're pulling out and we're also widening the lens, which will give this kind of weird distorted effect. It'll be subtle, but then, all good camera effects are subtle. So let's make sure we're not in record mode anymore. We're going to de-solo it and click away and then play our animation one more time. So we've got our shot overhead. We jump cut, mid shot to close up, character turns, and then we go over to our long shot, which is slowly kind of pulling towards, and then we go back to close up, and then we go to mid shot, and in the mid shot we're slowly kind of expanding the field of view at the same time, so you get this kind of slow pull out, but also a kind of widening of what the camera can actually see, which is really cool. Now that's our animation done. So the last bit of polish we're going to do is add in some audio. So we've got some music for you. And also we're going to put in a fade in and out just using a simple UI. So I'm going to save my scene. I'm going to go to create in the hierarchy, go to UI and image. So the UI image will create a simple white square in your screen there. What we're going to do is just to click on the Rec Transforms Anchor Preset button with this thing here, hold down Alt, hold down Shift, and then click in the lower right corner, this button here. That is going to fill the screen with that image. So when I look in my scene view and zoom all the way out, well, maybe not that far out, what you'll notice in this project is I've been very sneaky and hidden the UI layer. If I toggle that on, you can see that it's this giant UI where the image is filling up the canvas. So I'm going to deselect that now. We're just going to worry about the game view because that's the only place we really want to see it, as it's just a simple fade in out. And in the image component of the image game object, I'm going to just select the color box and I'm going to drag that down to black. So we're fading in and out from black. Then quite simply, I'm going to add an animation track to my timeline. So add track in the timeline, animation track. I'm going to drag on my image game object. I'm going to allow it to create an animator. And then I'm going to hit record. So right now, when I select the image, I want to right click on color and choose add key. So I'm now keyframing this thing. So at the start, we want it to be fully black and then we want it to fade in. So I'm going to fade it in, like maybe a third of the way through the drone moving. So something like that. Then I'm going to right click on color again, say add key. And this time bring up the color picker, drag the A for alpha down to 0. So it's this last slider here. So now we've faded that with timeline, and I'm going to drag all the way to the end when I want it to start fading out, somewhere like that. Add another keyframe, and then right at the end, when we know that it's about to stop, add one final keyframe, and I'm going to then increase the alpha all the way to the max so that it fades all the way back up, blocking our view of the entire animation. So I'm going to uncheck my recording arming there, so it's not recording anymore, save my scene, and press play. So it should start black and fade in. There we go. Play the whole animation. So again, going through, mid shot, close up, characters turning around, jump to the long shot, pull back to close up, then to mid, and then at the end, that UI is going to fade back in to effectively end the whole animation, the whole film. So that's the UI, that's the fading in and out. And then the very last thing we want to do is to add in some music that's also going to fade in and out. So I'm going to reselect CM cameras where my timeline is, and I'm going to add one more track. So go to add, go to audio track, and then all I'm going to do is just drop on a piece of music. So if you go to the tutorial folder and go into audio, you'll see that I've made a quick track in there and I can drop it on there. So what it does effectively is it's spawning an audio source for you. You can control an audio source with this, but you don't have to. If you just leave it how it is, then it's not going to be too concerned with that. Now I want to effectively, fade this in. And the way that we can do that is to use the blending controls in the inspector. So when I select my track, I can say an ease in duration of say 3 seconds and ease out of 3 seconds as well. And you can see I get that nice line there. And I can use that if I'm blending with another audio clip, but we're not doing that in this instance. So I'm just going to zoom out and I'm going to drag this all the way to the end, snap it on there so that it fades in and then fades back out again. And let's take a look, let's take a listen. So I saved my scene and I'm going to press play. So our music fades in. We have all of our different shots. We've seen this several times now. It's starting to get a little bit boring probably, but it's probably newer to you than it is to me. Cutting between shots, back to our close-up, the music's playing, and we know that we can expect it to fade out along with the fade to black at the end. So that's it. So that is how we create a simple cinematic inside of Unity with Timeline and with Cinemachine working together. So we've looked at how to use the Cinemachine virtual cameras, how to use the different animation tracks in Timeline. We've learned how to use the Dolly Track and how to make sure it's working in a kind of linear fashion, and how to tie different post effects profiles onto different cameras if you want to create a different look, or you need to do different things with focus. So that's it for this tutorial. I hope you liked it. Please share it with people, share the project with people. You can do whatever you want with it. It's all either made up of assets that Unity's released or stuff which was my own, like the environment and the audio track which I made. So it's all free to distribute, and hopefully you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.